The smell of fresh coffee and bacon filled the air as another busy morning began at Joe's Corner Diner, located right in the heart of Riverside. This little restaurant had been serving the community for over 15 years. Joe Patterson had bought the place when he was just 28, turning it from a rundown cafe into the town's favorite breakfast spot. Behind the counter, working quietly at the grill, was Rosa. She had been Joe's head cook for 3 years now. And honestly, he couldn't imagine running the place without her. Rosa knew every regular customer's order by heart. She could flip pancakes with one hand while scrambling eggs with the other. Her homemade salsa was so good that people drove from the next town over just to taste it, but Rosa was different from his other employees. While the waitresses chatted and laughed with customers, Rosa kept to herself. She arrived at work 15 minutes early every single day, hung up her coat in the same spot, and got straight to work. She never called in sick, never complained about working weekends, and rarely spoke unless someone asked her a direct question. Joe had always respected Rosa's quiet nature. Some people were just private, he figured. Plus, she was incredibly reliable. In 3 years, she had never burned an order, never been late, and never caused any drama with the other staff. She was the kind of employee every restaurant owner dreams of having. Rosa's daughter would sometimes visit after school. 8-year-old Sophia was a sweet kid with big brown eyes and long braided hair. She would sit in the corner booth with her homework spread out across the table, working on math problems while her mother finished the dinner shift. Sophia was just as quiet as her mother, but Joe noticed she was smart, really smart. She would finish her homework quickly and then read books that seemed too advanced for her age. Joe often wondered about Rosa's husband. In 3 years he had only met Roberto once, and that brief encounter had left him feeling uncomfortable. Roberto had stopped by the diner one evening, demanding to know why Rosa was working late. He spoke loudly, drawing stares from other customers. When Rosa tried to explain that they had a large catering order to prepare, Roberta grabbed her arm and told her they were leaving immediately. The way Rosa's face changed in that moment stuck with Joe. She looked scared. After that incident, Roberto never came inside again. Sometimes Joe would see him waiting in his truck outside, engine running, while Rosa hurried to finish closing duties. She would practically run to the parking lot, her head down, clutching her purse tightly. Joe found himself watching through the window until their truck disappeared down the street. It was a Tuesday evening in late October when Joe first noticed something that made his stomach turn. The dinner rush was winding down, and Rosa was cleaning the grill area. She reached up to grab plates from the high shelf above the prep station. As she stretched, her long sleeve rolled up slightly, revealing her wrist and forearm. Joe felt his breath catch in his throat. Dark purple bruises covered Rosa's wrist, looking like finger marks. They were in different stages of healing, some fresh and dark, others fading to yellow and green. When Rosa realized he was looking, she quickly pulled her sleeve down and turned away. Focusing intently on wiping down the already clean counter, Joe tried to convince himself he was seeing things. Maybe Rosa had fallen, maybe she bruised easily. Maybe it was something completely innocent. But deep down, he knew what those marks looked like. His own mother had worn long sleeves in summer when he was a kid, and he remembered the same pattern of bruises around her wrists and arms. Over the next few weeks, Joe found himself paying closer attention to things he had never noticed before. Rosa always parked her car in the far corner of the lot, behind the dumpster where it couldn't be seen from the street. She never answered her phone during work hours, even when it buzzed constantly in her apron pocket. When the kitchen door slammed shut from the wind, she would jump and look around nervously. But it was the changes in little Sophia that really worried Joe. The bright, curious child seemed to be withdrawing. She stopped asking for crayons to draw pictures while doing homework. She no longer smiled when Joe brought her free cookies. Instead, she kept her head down, working silently with an intensity that seemed wrong for a kid her age. One evening, as Joe was refilling the coffee machine, he overheard Sophia talking quietly to her mother in Spanish. Joe didn't speak Spanish well, but he caught a few words. Sophia was asking about going to school the next day, and Rosa was telling her daughter to wear her sweater, even though the weather was warm. When they switched to English, Sophia asked, "Will Papa be home when we get there?" The fear in that. The little girl's voice made Joe's heart ache. The next day, Sophia came to the diner wearing a long-sleeved sweater despite the 70-degree weather. When she rolled up her sleeves to wash her hands in the restroom, Joe glimpsed what looked like finger-shaped bruises on her small arm. That's when he knew for certain that his worst fears were true. Joe spent that entire night lying awake, staring at the ceiling. He thought about his own childhood, growing up in a house where raised voices and slamming doors were normal. He remembered being Sophia's age and wishing that just one adult would notice what was happening and do something about it. He had promised himself back then that if he ever saw another child in that situation, he wouldn't just stand by and do nothing, but knowing what to do was harder than he expected. Joe had heard horror stories about domestic violence situations, getting worse when outsiders tried to help. What if confronting the situation put Rosa and Sophia in more danger? What if Roberto found out someone at work was asking questions? What if Joe's interference made everything worse? Still, Joe couldn't shake the image of Sophia's frightened face or the sight of those bruises on Rosa's wrist. These weren't strangers he was reading about in the newspaper. This was happening right in front of him, to people he saw every single day. Rosa trusted him enough to work in his kitchen. Sophia felt safe enough to do her homework in his restaurant. Maybe that meant something. Joe decided he needed to learn more before taking any action. He started researching domestic violence online, reading about warning signs and resources for victims. What he learned both educated and horrified him. The isolation, the controlling behavior, the escalating violence, it all matched what he was observing with Rosa and Sophia. One thing became crystal clear from his research: victims of domestic violence needed to feel safe and supported before they could take action to help themselves. Joe realized that his diner might be the only place where Rosa felt truly safe. It was probably the only few hours of her day when she didn't have to worry about saying the wrong thing or moving the wrong way. From that day forward, Joe made small changes to show Rosa and Sophia they were valued and protected. He started keeping extra food at the end of each shift, always finding reasons why Rosa should take home leftovers. He told her that Sophia was welcome to stay as late as needed, even setting up a more comfortable study area in the back booth with better lighting and a small desk lamp. Joe also began paying attention to Rosa's schedule in a new way. If she seemed particularly nervous or if Sophia looked extra tired, he would find reasons to keep them both at the restaurant a little longer. Maybe there was inventory to count, or maybe he needed Rosa's opinion on a new menu item. Small delays that might give them a few more minutes of peace. The other employees started noticing Joe's extra attention to Rosa and Sophia, but he was careful not to say anything specific. He simply told his staff that Rosa was going through a difficult time at home and asked them to be extra supportive. The waitresses began including Sophia in their conversations, and the dishwasher started teaching her card tricks during slow periods. Slowly, Joe was building something around Rosa and Sophia, not quite protection, but a sense of community and safety. He hoped it would be enough to help when the time came for them to take the next step, because Joe was becoming more certain each day that Rosa and Sophia would need help to escape whatever was happening to them at home. Little did Joe know that his careful observations and quiet preparations were about to become the foundation for something much bigger than he ever imagined. Joe couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sophia's small face and those bruises on Rosa's wrist. He kept thinking about his own childhood, remembering how it felt when adults pretended not to see what was happening. The helplessness, the confusion, the feeling that maybe it was somehow normal because no one ever said it wasn't. By morning, Joe had made a decision. He couldn't ignore this anymore, but he also couldn't rush in without a plan. He had learned enough from his research to know that good intentions could sometimes make dangerous situations worse. When Rosa arrived for her shift that Tuesday morning, Joe watched her more carefully than ever before. She moved differently than she used to. Her shoulders were always slightly hunched, as if she was trying to make herself smaller. She kept glancing toward the windows, especially when cars pulled into the parking lot. And when the phone rang, she would freeze for just a moment before continuing with whatever she was doing. During the lunch rush, Joe noticed something new. Rosa was wearing makeup, which was unusual for her. She typically kept things simple for work, just her hair pulled back and maybe some lip balm. But today, there was concealer under her left eye, applied a little too thick. Joe felt sick realizing what she was probably trying to hide, around 2 o'clock. When the restaurant had emptied out, Joe's sister Linda stopped by. Linda worked as a counselor at the community health center, and Joe trusted her judgment more than anyone else's. After the last customer left, Joe asked Rosa if she could handle things alone for a few minutes while he stepped outside with Linda standing behind the diner. Joe told Linda everything he had observed. Linda listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You're right to be concerned," Linda finally said. "Everything you're describing fits the pattern. But Joe, you have to be really careful. Here, if her husband finds out that people at work are asking questions, he might take it out on her and Sophia." Linda explained that abusers often isolated their victims from work and friends, using threats and intimidation to maintain control. "The fact that Rosa has kept this job for 3 years is actually remarkable," Linda said. "It might be her only connection to the outside world." They talked for 20 minutes, with Linda giving Joe advice on how to help without making things worse. The most important thing, she explained, was to make Rosa feel safe and supported without pushing her to talk before she was ready. Linda also gave Joe some pamphlets about domestic violence resources, suggesting he keep them somewhere Rosa might see them without feeling pressured. When Joe went back inside, he found Rosa cleaning tables that were already spotless. She worked with an intensity that seemed desperate, as if staying busy could somehow protect her from her thoughts. Joe wanted to say something comforting, but he remembered Linda's advice about not pushing too hard. Instead, Joe made small changes to show Rosa she was valued. When a customer complained about waiting too long for their order during the dinner rush, Joe defended Rosa publicly, praising her cooking skills and work ethic. When Rosa offered to stay late to prep for the next day, Joe insisted she go home on time, saying the prep could wait until morning. These small gestures seemed to mean something to Rosa. Joe caught her looking at him sometimes with an expression he couldn't quite read, surprise maybe, or gratitude. It was as if she wasn't used to people standing up for her or putting her needs first. Sophia continued coming to the diner after school, but Joe noticed she was becoming even more withdrawn. She used to hum quietly while doing homework, but now she worked in complete silence. When other customers tried to talk to her, she would answer politely but briefly, then return to her books with a focus that seemed forced. One afternoon, while Rosa was in the back checking inventory, Joe sat down across from Sophia in her usual booth. He brought her a glass of chocolate milk and a cookie, trying to seem casual. "How's school going, Sophia?" Joe asked. Sophia looked up briefly, then back at her math worksheet. "It's fine," she said quietly. "That looks like pretty advanced math for 3rd grade, Joe observed. "I'm in 4th grade now," Sophia corrected, still not meeting his eyes. "And it's 5th grade math. My teacher says I'm ahead." Joe felt a surge of pride for this smart little girl, followed immediately by anger at whoever was hurting her. That's really impressive, Sophia. You must work very hard." For the first time in weeks, Sophia looked directly at him. "Mama says education is the most important thing. She says if I study hard enough, I can go to college someday and have a different life." The way Sophia said "different life" made Joe's heart break. This 8-year-old was already thinking about escape, already understanding that her current situation wasn't normal or acceptable. "Your mama's absolutely right," Joe said gently. "And you know what? If you ever need a quiet place to study, even when your mama's not working, you're always welcome here. I could set up a special table just for homework." Sophia's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly. "Thank you, Mr. Joe," she whispered. That evening, Joe made another discovery that confirmed his worst fears. He was taking out the trash around closing time when he heard voices from the parking lot. Rosa and Roberto were standing by their truck, and Roberto was clearly angry about something. Joe couldn't make out all the words, but he heard enough. Roberto was accusing Rosa of talking to people at work, of spending too much time away from home. His voice was low and threatening, and Rosa kept trying to calm him down. Speaking in the submissive tone Joe had heard her use when customers were particularly difficult, Joe stepped back into the shadows, not wanting to be seen but unable to walk away. Through the dim parking lot lighting, he watched Roberto grab Rosa's arm, the same arm where Joe had seen those finger-shaped bruises. Rosa didn't pull away or protest. She just stood there, taking it, probably trying to minimize the consequences she would face later. When they finally drove away, Joe stood in the darkness for a long time, feeling helpless and furious. He thought about calling the police, but Linda had explained that without Rosa's cooperation, there was little they could do. Most domestic violence cases required the victim to press charges, and many victims were too frightened to take that step. The next morning, Rosa arrived at work wearing long sleeves despite the warm weather. She moved more carefully than usual, favoring her left side slightly. When she reached for items on high shelves, Joe noticed her wince. The message was clear. Roberto had made good on whatever threats he had made in the parking lot. Joe spent his lunch break researching local resources. He learned about the women's shelter 2 towns over, about legal aid services for domestic violence victims, and about safety planning strategies. He also discovered that their small town had a family crisis counselor who worked with the police department on domestic violence cases, but the more Joe learned, the more complex the situation seemed. Rosa was probably financially dependent on Roberto. She might not have a driver's license or access to their bank accounts. She might not even have legal documentation if she was undocumented, something Joe had never thought to consider, but now worried about. There was also Sophia to consider. Any escape plan would need to account for a child's needs, school records, custody issues, the trauma of leaving everything familiar behind. Joe realized that helping Rosa and Sophia would require more than just good intentions. It would take careful planning and probably the help of several different people. That evening, as Joe was counting the day's receipts, he made a decision. He couldn't solve this problem alone, and he couldn't wait for it to solve itself. Rosa and Sophia needed help, and they needed it soon. Joe could see the situation escalating. Roberto's anger seemed to be increasing, and Rosa's fear was becoming more obvious every day. Joe pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. Linda had given him the number for Detective Karen Mills, who specialized in family violence cases. Joe had been hesitant to involve law enforcement, worried about making things worse. But now he realized that doing nothing was also a choice, one that could have terrible consequences. Before he lost his nerve, Joe dialed the number. It was time to start building a real support system around Rosa and Sophia, one that could help them when they were ready to take the next step toward safety. Joe just hoped he wasn't already too late. Detective Karen Mills answered her phone on the second ring, even though it was nearly 9 o'clock in the evening. Joe had expected to leave a voicemail, so he stumbled over his words at first, trying to explain who he was and why he was calling. "Take your time," Detective Mills said calmly. "I have all night if you need it." Something about her voice made Joe feel like he could trust her. Over the next 30 minutes, he told her everything he had observed about Rosa and Sophia. Detective Mills asked thoughtful questions, never making Joe feel like he was overreacting or wasting her time. "You're absolutely right to be concerned," she said when Joe finished. "And you're also right to be careful about how you approach this. I've seen well-meaning people accidentally make dangerous situations worse by moving too fast." Detective Mills explained that domestic violence cases required patience and careful planning. "The victim has to be ready to accept help," she said. "Our job is to make sure that help is available when she reaches that point." She agreed to meet with Joe the next day during his lunch break. "But let's meet somewhere private," she suggested. "Not at the diner. We don't want to raise any suspicions." They arranged to meet at the public library in a quiet corner where they could talk without being overheard. Joe spent the rest of the evening feeling both relieved and nervous. He was finally taking real action, but he also felt the weight of responsibility. Rosa and Sophia's safety might depend on him making the right decisions. The next morning, Rosa arrived at work with a black eye that no amount of makeup could completely hide. She had tried to cover it with concealer and foundation, but the swelling was too obvious. When she thought no one was looking, she would gently touch the area around her eye, wincing slightly. Joe felt sick with anger, but he forced himself to act normal. He couldn't let Rosa know he was meeting with a detective, at least not yet. Instead, he made sure to give her easier tasks that day, nothing that required reaching high shelves or heavy lifting. When customers asked about menu items, Joe handled most of the questions himself, giving Rosa space to work quietly in the back. Sophia came to the diner after school as usual, but she took one look at her mother's face and burst into tears. Rosa quickly pulled her daughter into the back office, speaking to her in rapid Spanish. Joe couldn't understand the words, but he could hear Rosa trying to comfort Sophia while probably also trying to explain away what had happened. When they came back out, Sophia's eyes were red from crying, but she had composed herself. She sat in her usual booth and opened her homework, but Joe noticed her hands were shaking as she tried to write. This little girl was living with trauma that no child should ever experience. At lunchtime, Joe told Rosa he had to run some errands and left his assistant manager in charge. The library was only 5 minutes away, but Joe spent the entire drive rehearsing what he would say to Detective Mills. She was waiting for him in the back corner of the library, sitting at a small table with a notebook and a cup of coffee. Detective Mills was younger than Joe had expected, maybe in her 30s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude that immediately put him at ease. "Tell me about this morning," she said after they shook hands. Joe described Rosa's black eye and Sophia's reaction. Detective Mills took notes as he spoke, asking follow-up questions about timing and Rosa's behavior patterns. "I've been doing this for 8 years, Detective Mills said when Joe finished. "What you're describing is classic escalation. The violence is getting worse and more frequent. That means Rosa and her daughter are in increasing danger." She explained that abusers often escalated their violence when they felt their control slipping. "Something has changed in their household dynamic," she said. "Maybe Rosa has been showing small signs of independence, working more hours, building relationships at work. That can trigger an abuser to become more violent." Detective Mills outlined several steps they could take to help Rosa when she was ready. First, they needed to build a safety network of people Rosa trusted. Second, they needed to identify resources Rosa would need if she decided to leave shelter: legal aid, financial assistance, and help with Sophia's school situation. But the most important thing, Detective Mills emphasized, is that Rosa has to make the decision herself. We can't force her to leave or press charges. We can only make sure she has options when she's ready to use them. Joe asked about involving other people from the community. Detective Mills thought it was a good idea, but warned him to be selective. "You want people who can keep things confidential and who understand the seriousness of the situation," she said. "Too many people knowing could create gossip, and gossip could get back to Rosa's husband." They agreed that Joe would identify 3 or 4 trusted community members who might be willing to help. Detective Mills would research the best resources for Rosa's specific situation and start building a safety plan. "One more thing," Detective Mills said as they prepared to leave. "If you ever see immediate danger, if Rosa comes to work with serious injuries, or if you witness Roberto being violent, call 911 immediately. Don't try to handle it yourself." Joe drove back to the diner feeling both hopeful and overwhelmed. He now had a plan, but he also realized how complicated the situation really was. This wasn't just about helping Rosa leave an abusive marriage. It was about helping a mother and daughter completely rebuild their lives. That afternoon, Joe started thinking about who else he could trust to help. Dr. Patricia Wong had been coming to the diner for breakfast every Tuesday for 5 years. She was a family physician with a gentle manner and a reputation for going above and beyond for her patients. Joe had seen her treat everything from scraped knees to serious emergencies with equal compassion. There was also Father Miguel from St. Anthony's Church, where Joe had noticed Rosa and Sophia attending Sunday services. Father Miguel spoke fluent Spanish and had a long history of helping immigrant families navigate difficult situations. Joe had heard him talk about the church's commitment to protecting vulnerable community members, and then there was Betty Chun, who ran the women's clothing store downtown. Betty had survived her own abusive marriage 20 years ago and now quietly helped other women in similar situations. She never talked about it openly, but Joe had heard stories about Betty providing clothes, transportation, and emotional support to women who needed to leave dangerous relationships. Joe decided to approach Dr. Wong first. She came in the next Tuesday morning at her usual time, ordering coffee and wheat toast while reading medical journals. When the morning rush died down, Joe sat across from her in her booth. "Dr. Wong, I need to talk to you about something serious," Joe began. "It's about one of my employees." Dr. Wong immediately put down her journal and gave Joe her full attention. Joe explained the situation, being careful not to mention Rosa by name at first. Dr. Wong listened with the same focused attention she probably gave her patients. "I've suspected something like this might be happening," Dr. Wong said quietly. "I've seen Rosa and her daughter at the grocery store a few times. The child always stays very close to her mother, and they both seem watchful, like they're always aware of their surroundings." Joe asked if Dr. Wong would be willing to help when the time came. Without hesitation, she agreed. "I can provide medical documentation of injuries if needed," she said. "And I know specialists who work with trauma victims. Both Rosa and Sophia will need medical and psychological support." Over the next week, Joe had similar conversations with Father Miguel and Betty Chun. Both agreed to help. And Joe was amazed by how quickly a support network was forming around Rosa and Sophia. Father Miguel offered to provide sanctuary at the church if Rosa needed immediate safety. "We've done this before," he said simply. "The church has always been a place of refuge for those in need." Betty Chun was even more direct. "I have contacts at the women's shelter, and I keep emergency supplies, clothes, shoes, toiletries, for situations exactly like this," she said. "I can also help with job placement if Rosa needs to relocate." By the end of the week, Joe felt like they had assembled a team of people who could help Rosa and Sophia transition to safety. But he also knew that the hardest part was still ahead. Waiting for Rosa to reach the point where she was ready to accept help, Joe didn't have to wait much longer. The following Monday morning, Rosa arrived at work with injuries that couldn't be hidden with makeup. Her lip was split, there were bruises on her neck, and she moved like someone whose ribs were sore. When she tried to lift a heavy pot, she gasped in pain and had to put it down. Joe knew that Rosa had reached a breaking point. The question now was whether she would trust him enough to let him help her find a way out. Joe's hands were shaking as he watched Rosa try to work that Monday morning. Her split lip made it difficult for her to speak clearly, and every movement seemed to cause her pain. When she bent down to get supplies from the lower cabinets, she had to grip the counter to steady herself. The bruises on her neck were dark purple, clearly visible despite her attempts to cover them with a scarf. The breakfast rush was particularly busy that day, but Joe found himself constantly glancing toward the kitchen, watching Rosa struggle through tasks that should have been routine. When she accidentally dropped a plate, the crash made her flinch so violently that Joe knew she was reliving whatever had happened to her at home. Around 10 o'clock. When the last breakfast customer had left, Joe made his decision. He walked into the kitchen where Rosa was mechanically washing dishes, moving slowly and carefully. "Rosa," he said gently, "we need to talk." She looked up at him with fear in her eyes, probably expecting to be fired or criticized for working slowly. Instead, Joe pulled up a chair and sat down across from her at the prep table. "I know what's happening to you at home," Joe said quietly, "and I want you to know that you're not alone. There are people who want to help you and Sophia." Rosa's face crumpled as she began to cry. Not the quiet tears Joe had seen her wipe away before, but deep, desperate sobs that seemed to come from years of holding everything inside. Joe sat with her, not saying anything. just letting her release the emotions she had been carrying alone for so long. When Rosa finally looked up, her eyes were red, but there was something different in them, a tiny spark of hope that hadn't been there before. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "Roberto says if I ever try to leave, he'll find me wherever I go. He says no one will believe me and that Sophia will be taken away from me. I'm so scared, Mr. Joe. I'm scared all the time." Joe reached across the table and gently placed his hand over hers. "Rosa, I believe you. And there are other people in this town who believe you too. People who want to help you and Sophia have a safe life." Over the next hour, Joe told Rosa about the support network he had been quietly building. He explained about Detective Mills, Dr. Wong, Father Miguel, and Betty Chun. He told her about the women's shelter and the legal resources that were available. Most importantly, he assured her that any decision about what to do next was completely hers to make. "You don't have to decide anything today," Joe said. "But I want you to know that when you're ready, you won't have to face this alone." Rosa listened to everything Joe said, asking occasional questions about safety and about what would happen to Sophia. When Joe mentioned that Dr. Wong could document her injuries for legal purposes, Rosa nodded slowly. Rosa said finally, I think I'm ready to talk to someone, but I'm scared Roberto will find out." Joe explained that Dr. Wong could see her privately, and that everything would be kept confidential until Rosa decided what she wanted to do. They arranged for Rosa to leave work early that afternoon, telling the other employees that she had a doctor's appointment. Dr. Wong's office was in a medical building across town, far from anywhere Roberto might see Rosa's car. Joe drove Rosa there himself, parking in the back of the building and walking with her to a side entrance that Dr. Wong had arranged to keep unlocked. The examination was thorough and heartbreaking. Dr. Wang documented bruises in various stages of healing, the split lip, possible rib injuries, and older scars that told the story of years of abuse. She took photographs for legal evidence and wrote detailed notes about each injury. "Rosa," Dr. Wong said gently when the examination was finished, "you and Sophia are in serious danger. The pattern of injuries I'm seeing suggests that the violence is escalating. I'm concerned that if you stay, the next incident could be life-threatening." Rosa nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know," she whispered. "Last night was the worst it's ever been. He was angry because Sophia got an award at school, and he said I was trying to make him look bad by encouraging her to be too smart." Dr. Wong and Joe exchanged glances. The fact that Roberto was threatened by an 8-year-old's academic success showed just how dangerous his mindset had become. When they returned to the diner, Joe called Detective Mills and arranged for her to meet with Rosa the next morning. He also contacted Father Miguel and Betty Chun, letting them know that Rosa was ready to start planning her escape that evening. After Rosa and Sophia had gone home, Joe made another phone call, this time to his friend Tom Bradley, who owned the moving company in town. Tom had helped other families in crisis situations before, and Joe trusted him to be discreet. "I need your help with something sensitive," Joe explained. "There's a woman and her daughter who need to relocate quickly and safely. Can you help without asking too many questions?" Tom didn't hesitate. "When and where?" he asked simply. The next morning, Rosa met with Detective Mills in the back office of the diner before opening time. Detective Mills had brought information about the women's shelter, legal aid services, and safety planning resources. More importantly, she had researched Roberto's background and discovered that he had been arrested for domestic violence before in another state. "This information strengthens your case significantly," Detective Mills explained. "It shows a pattern of behavior that will help if you decide to seek a restraining order." Rosa listened carefully as Detective Mills outlined the steps involved in leaving safely. The most dangerous time for domestic violence victims, she explained, was often when they tried to leave. That's why careful planning was essential. "We need to choose a time when Roberto will be away from the house for several hours," Detective Mills said. "We'll need to get your important documents, some clothes for you and Sophia, and anything else that can't be replaced. But your safety is more important than any possessions." Rosa mentioned that Roberto worked construction and was usually away from 7 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. On Thursdays, he had a standing appointment at a bar with his coworkers that kept him out until late in the evening. Thursday would be ideal, Detective Mills said. That gives us the whole day to move you and get you settled somewhere safe before he realizes you're gone. Over the next 2 days, the support network Joe had built swung into action with remarkable efficiency. Betty Chun prepared emergency supplies, clothes in Rosa and Sophia's sizes, toiletries, basic household items, and even some toys and books for Sophia. Father Miguel arranged for temporary housing at a safe house connected to his church network. Dr. Wong prepared copies of all medical records and contacted a trauma counselor who specialized in working with children. Joe himself took care of the practical details that others might overlook. He helped Rosa gather Sophia's school records and medical information. He arranged for Rosa's final paycheck to be ready and helped her open a new bank account that Roberto couldn't access. He even coordinated with Sophia's teacher to arrange for a smooth transition to a new school. The most amazing thing was how the community seemed to instinctively understand the importance of keeping everything quiet. Word spread among the trusted circle of helpers, but no one gossiped or asked unnecessary questions. Everyone simply focused on their part of the plan. Tom Bradley volunteered his truck and his time, refusing to accept payment for the move. Some things are more important than money, he said, when Joe tried to pay him. Dr. Wong arranged for Rosa and Sophia to have priority appointments with counselors in their new location. Healing from trauma takes time, she explained to Joe. But with the right support, both of them can recover and build healthy, happy lives. Father Miguel provided something equally valuable: spiritual and emotional support. He spent time with Rosa, helping her understand that leaving wasn't abandoning her marriage vows, but protecting herself and her daughter from harm. God doesn't want his children to live in fear, Father Miguel told her. Sometimes the most faithful thing we can do is remove ourselves from danger. By Wednesday evening, everything was in place. Rosa would work her usual shift Thursday morning, giving her an alibi in case Roberto checked up on her. At noon, when Roberto would be having lunch with his construction crew, the moving team would meet Rosa at her house. By evening, she and Sophia would be safely relocated to a new town, with new jobs, new schools, and a fresh start. Joe spent that Wednesday night unable to sleep, not from worry, but from amazement at what had happened. In less than a week, a group of people who barely knew each other had come together to save 2 lives. It was like watching the best of human nature in action, people caring for strangers, taking risks to help others, and proving that communities could still rally around those in need. Thursday morning arrived with clear skies and warm sunshine, as if even the weather was cooperating with their plan. Rosa came to work as usual, but Joe could see the difference in her face. For the first time in months, she looked hopeful. The fear was still there, but it was mixed with determination and the beginning of peace. The hardest part was almost over. In just a few hours, Rosa and Sophia would be free. Thursday at noon, Joe's heart was pounding as he watched the clock. Rosa had left work 30 minutes earlier, saying she felt sick and needed to go home. Everyone else thought she was genuinely ill, but Joe knew she was about to take the biggest step of her life. At exactly 12:15, Joe's phone buzzed with a text from Tom Bradley. Moving truck is in position. Rosa's car is in the driveway. Coast is clear. The plan was simple but carefully coordinated. Detective Mills was parked at the end of Rosa's street, watching for any sign of Roberto returning early. Tom and his assistant were at the house with boxes and equipment. Betty Chun was standing by with emergency supplies. Father Miguel was waiting at the church, ready to provide sanctuary if anything went wrong. Joe tried to act normal during the lunch rush, but his hands were shaking as he poured coffee and took orders. Every time his phone buzzed, his heart jumped. At 1:30, he got the text he'd been waiting for. Personal items secured. Moving to Phase 2. Phase 2 involved the most important belongings: Rosa's important documents, Sophia's school records, family photos, and the few valuable items they couldn't replace. Tom had estimated this would take about an hour. Assuming everything went smoothly. At 2:30, another text arrived. Unexpected visitor. Pausing operation. Joe's blood ran cold. Had Roberto come home early? Was Rosa in danger? He immediately called Detective Mills, who was still positioned at the end of the street. It's okay, Detective Mills said quickly. It's just a neighbor who wanted to chat. Rosa handled it perfectly. Told her she was doing some spring cleaning. The neighbor left after 5 minutes. By 3 o'clock, the moving truck was loaded and pulling away from Rosa's house. Rosa followed in her own car, taking a route they had planned that avoided Roberto's usual hangouts. Sophia was with her, excited about what she thought was just a surprise trip to visit relatives. Joe closed the diner early that day, something he had never done before. He drove to the church where Rosa and Sophia were meeting with Father Miguel before continuing to their new home. When Joe arrived, he found Rosa sitting in the church office, holding Sophia on her lap while Father Miguel explained that they were going to live in a new place where they would be safe. Sophia, being 8 years old, had lots of questions. Why? Were they leaving? What about her school? What about her friends? Rosa answered each question patiently, explaining that sometimes families need to make big changes to be happy and healthy. But what about Papa? Sophia asked, the question they had all been dreading. Rosa took a deep breath. Papa is sick, she said gently. He gets very angry sometimes, and that's not safe for us. We're going to live somewhere else while he tries to get better. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was all that an 8-year-old could understand. Joe watched this conversation and felt amazed by Rosa's strength. Even after everything she had been through, she was trying to protect Sophia from hating her father. The drive to Rosa's new home took 2 hours. Joe followed their car, wanting to make sure they arrived safely. The apartment Betty Chun had arranged was small but clean, in a quiet neighborhood where Rosa had already been hired at a family restaurant. Sophia would start at a new school on Monday, where the counselors were already prepared to help her adjust. That evening, as Joe helped Rosa unpack boxes in her new kitchen, she started crying again. But these were different tears from the ones he had seen before. I can't believe people I barely knew would do all this for me, she said. In my whole life, no one has ever helped me like this. I thought I would die in that house, and Sophia would grow up thinking that was normal. Joe felt his own eyes getting wet. Rosa, you're not alone anymore. You never have to be alone again. Over the next few weeks, Joe kept in touch with Rosa through text messages and phone calls. She sent him pictures of Sophia at her new school, smiling and playing with other children. Rosa herself was healing, both physically and emotionally. The bruises faded, but more importantly, the fear in her eyes was disappearing. Roberto discovered they were gone when he came home Thursday evening. According to Detective Mills, he flew into a rage, destroying much of what was left in the house. He went to the diner Friday morning, demanding to know where Rosa was. Joe calmly told him that Rosa no longer worked there and that he had no information about her whereabouts. Roberto tried to intimidate Joe, but this time he wasn't dealing with a frightened woman alone in her kitchen. Joe stood his ground, and when Roberto's voice got louder, 3 regular customers, all local men who knew the situation, stood up from their tables and moved closer. Roberto got the message and left. He tried a few more times to find Rosa, going to the school, the church, and even Betty Chun's store, but the community had closed ranks around Rosa's secret. No one knew anything, no one had seen anything, and no one was willing to help Roberto in his search. After 2 weeks of getting nowhere, Roberto left town. Detective Mills later learned that he had moved back to his home state, where he eventually got arrested again for threatening his new girlfriend. Rosa's decision to leave had probably saved his next victim as well. The impact of Rosa's story spread through Riverside in ways Joe never expected. Word got around about how the community had come together to help a family in crisis. Other people started paying attention to signs of domestic violence, and several more victims found the courage to seek help. Dr. Wong started a monthly support group for domestic violence survivors. Betty Chun organized a clothing drive that became a permanent resource for women fleeing abusive situations. Father Miguel began giving sermons about recognizing and responding to abuse in their community. Most importantly, Joe realized that his diner had become known as a safe place where people could find help if they needed it. He put up a small sign in the restroom with the domestic violence hotline number, and he trained all his employees to recognize warning signs and respond appropriately. 6 months later, Joe received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a photo of Rosa and Sophia at Sophia's school science fair, where she had won first place for a project about solar energy. Sophia was holding her blue ribbon and grinning from ear to ear. Rosa stood behind her, and Joe was amazed by the transformation. This was a woman who looked healthy, confident, and genuinely happy. The note with the photo was brief. "Thank you for giving us our lives back. Sophia wants to be a scientist now, and I'm taking English classes at night. We think about all of you every day. Love, Rosa and Sophia." Joe hung the photo behind the cash register where he could see it every day. Customers often asked about the smiling woman and little girl, and Joe would tell them it was just a reminder that small acts of kindness could change everything. A year later, Rosa called Joe with incredible news. She had saved enough money to bring her mother from Mexico to live with them. Sophia was speaking English fluently and had been placed in the gifted program at school. Rosa herself had been promoted to assistant manager at her restaurant and was planning to take business classes. "I have a real life now," Rosa told Joe during that phone call. Sophia doesn't flinch when people raise their voices. She laughs all the time. She's becoming the child she was always meant to be. But the most meaningful call came 2 years after Rosa left Riverside. Sophia, now 10 years old, had asked her mother for Joe's phone number because she wanted to call him herself. "Mr. Joe," Sophia said in clear, confident English, "I wanted to thank you for saving our lives. My teacher says I should write essays about people who inspire me, and I always write about you. I want you to know that when I grow up and become a scientist, I'm going to help other kids like me." Joe had to sit down during that phone call because he was crying too hard to stand up. This little girl, who had once been too scared to speak above a whisper, was now talking about her dreams and her future with absolute confidence. Years passed, and Joe never forgot the lesson Rosa and Sophia had taught him. He learned that heroism wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic rescues. It was about paying attention, caring enough to act, and understanding that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to look away. When someone needs help, Joe's Diner became legendary in Riverside, not for its food, but for being the place where one man's decision to care had saved 2 lives and changed an entire community's understanding of what it meant to look out for each other. The story was told and retold, inspiring others to pay attention to the people around them and to never underestimate the power of compassion in action. And somewhere in another state, a young woman named Sophia was working toward her dream of becoming a scientist, carrying with her the knowledge that there were good people in the world who would stand up and help when help was needed most.